Well, thank you guys so much for joining for the last part of today. So I'm really excited to be here. And my name is Lucas-Chong. My focus here, my focus in Teachers College is museum education, and specifically my topic is on early childhood programs in art museums. My advisor is Dr. Olga Hubbard, and I'm really grateful to all of her advisement that she has basically taught me how a museum can be yet another type of classroom for all visitors. And so that's really kind of what I've been thinking about as I've been working on my dissertation. So my dissertation is early childhood programs in art museums. So early childhood officially, at least according to the United States Department of Education, is ages birth through 5, which is actually pretty wide range if you think about it, a very wide range of development for, but for the purpose of my dissertation, I am specifically looking at ages 2 through 5. And the reason for that is because the programs that I'm highlighting in my dissertation cater specifically to that age group. Because prior to age 2, these children are basically considered infants. It's infancy, and they're primarily pre-verbal. And in museum education, there's actually a separate, many museums, there's actually a separate type of programming for that age, which is sometimes called stroller tours. And then next comes the early childhood programs, which is what I'm looking at, ages 2 through 4, but also sometimes 5-year-olds. And the reason for that is because 5 and up is when children are mandated to attend formal schooling. We see kindergartens. So what I'm looking at specifically is this age of 2 through 5. So when I refer to early childhood, that's what I'm talking about, is this specific age. And so my own background in teaching is really where my research stems from. So originally I have a background in painting, and I'm from Ohio. So I went to University of Cincinnati for painting, and then I chose to work in classroom education, to become an art teacher in schools. And then after that, I got my master's at Teachers College and really started thinking about museums as a yet another type of classroom. And after that, I began working in art museums and working with visitors of all ages and all abilities. So I love working with kids who are elementary school age, and also middle school and high school, and adults of all ages, college students, graduate students. But after about 7 years of working with all of these different age groups in museums and lots of different capacities, then after that, I was really given this challenge of working with early childhood visitors. So what I had always done before was maybe conduct inquiry-based tours, which would be maybe an hour-long discussion with visitors. Maybe it's school groups who would come in of 3rd graders, and we would look at an art object or maybe a series of 3 objects and have some pretty in-depth conversations about what's happening in the artworks, maybe how does it resonate with us in our own personal lives, and maybe do some sketching, maybe some type of activity, maybe some posing, some movement activities. And this is all great and really fun, and I love hearing about these experiences with all these different visitors. But it wasn't until the museums where I was working with started to develop early childhood programs when everything that I had known about teaching in museums had completely turned around. So for me, at least, this was the ultimate challenge of figuring out, how do I apply what I know about teaching to this, for me, and also to the institutions where I was working with. This was a new population. So this traditional, or what I had been accustomed to, this 1-hour visit where we have this inquiry-based experience only in art galleries, it was not applicable to 2, 3, and 4-year-old children. So you can imagine some of us educators who were teaching in these new programs for this age group we see maybe by the end of 45 minutes, there's like some kids like starting to play with their shoelaces, taking their shoes off, kind of some of kids even rolling on the floor of the gallery, just because this format is not developmentally appropriate for this age group. So even though some of us educators were struggling with this and we were trying to problem solve, we did find that there are some institutions, even within our own city, New York City, that have, some of them have had long-standing programs that we've started to look to and see what are these museums doing that's working? How can they really welcome this particular age group? And so that's why I thought, actually, just for a moment, if we could pause and think for a minute about maybe some experience that we have, you yourself have, with a child who's maybe 2, 3, or 4, or maybe even 5 years old. Maybe this child that you can think of right now, maybe this child is your neighbor. Maybe this child is the kid who was kicking the back of your seat on the bus yesterday, or maybe it's somebody in your own family or extended family. But I'm just going to ask you to think right now about a child who you know of or have had experience with recently who's of this age, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I'm going to ask you just to think about one word that comes to mind when you think about that child. I'll give you just like 2 seconds to think about that word. And then anybody want to just shout out loud? What's one word?
Energetic.
Energetic.
GRAE.
Oh, sorry, I hear one and then
ADD.
ADD.
GRAE.
Grabby. I love that. Grabby. Inquisitive.
Precocious.
Precocious.
Honest.
Yeah. I heard another one.
Oh, I was going to say inquisitive.
Inquisitive. Yeah. Yeah.
Noisy.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have noisy, we have inquisitive, honest, grabby. What was the other one?
Energetic.
Energetic, okay. So some of these words that we have, some of these might not necessarily would be used to describe what you would traditionally describe as the average museum goer, or maybe what you consider that a museum had in mind, an art museum, let me be specific, an art museum would have in mind as they were creating their space. So most art museums, when they were developed, were not creating their space for somebody who's a noisy visitor, for somebody who is a grabby visitor, well, hopefully though, it would be a welcoming space for somebody who is inquisitive, for somebody who's honest. But that's what, when we think about early learners, this age group, as we all know as educators, every single individual, no matter what your age, we all have our own unique ways of learning. We're all incredibly different individuals. However, we must admit that early learners definitely learn differently, when we're speaking generally, learn differently than an adult. So as we're thinking about all these ideas about what describes an early learner developmentally, a lot of the things that art museums traditionally have in place for them, it's not necessarily developmentally appropriate. So what I hoped to do was to find out in my own institutions where I was teaching, how can we create a program that's developmentally appropriate that allows children of this age to be their best selves while they're enjoying being in the museum space. So what I began to do was to try to figure that out for the populations that were specific to the museums where I worked, but also started to look beyond and see how other institutions have conducted their programs to welcome these visitors. So around the time when I began working on this dissertation, there were a lot of museums in New York City that were starting to create these programs specifically for this age group. And I know I call this the problem. It's not really a problem, it's a great thing. But it's interesting though that at the time, a lot of these programs were popping up. And there were various reasons for this, and I actually conducted a pilot study a little while ago as a precursor to my dissertation research. And I was asking museum administrators about what were the reasons for creating these programs? What do you attribute this to? What were you thinking about? And one reason that was given was, well, we had a gap We just noticed we had a gap in our programming. We have stroller tours for babies, and then we have family programs for kids 5 and up. There's nothing in between. So they just realized, you know what, we have a gap, and we want to have families or visitors to keep coming throughout. So there was a gap there. That's the reason why they started the programming. Another reason as well that I heard from one administrator in particular said that it makes the museum money. People will pay to come bring their kids here, and there's a desire for that, and the museum actually needs the funding. So there's a lot of different reasons for this programming, for the increase of this programming. And then also there's a new cultural shift as well, that museums, we're trying our best to be a little bit, hopefully, more accessible to all visitors. That's the desire. Obviously, as a culture in museums, that has not happened yet. We have a long way to go, obviously, but this is one little step in which we can welcome a larger range of visitors, is by catering to different age groups. So I think this is also a cultural shift. Is this reason why we have these types of programs arising? There's more awareness that we need to bring in more people. And then also there's a greater focus on early childhood education in general. Specifically, even in New York City right now, there's universal pre-K. All 4-year-olds can attend preschool for free. And now there's also universal 3K is being rolled out in some neighborhoods, and it's increasing in New York City. So there's a growing interest in early childhood education in general. So these are some of the reasons why this has increased. This type of programming has increased in New York City, and it's also increasing across the globe. And then also part of this problem is that that many institutions, as these museums are rolling out, saying, hey, you know, there's a gap in our programming. Let's make a program for 2-year-olds. That sounds great. Okay, some of our educators who teach high school programs can also teach the 2-year-old program. Done, go do it. Well, we need to kind of figure out a way to make this happen. And as I discovered in my own teaching and also in my research, there are some places that have done a very beautiful job of welcoming this age group. So that's why I began to pose some of these questions. In addition to, one more thing to also add is that as I'm figuring out these issues that are arising with this, with the growth of these programs, I'm also trying to figure out that there's actually a gap in research as well. So even though these programs exist, some of these programs do know really how to address the needs of this age group, but there's definitely a gap in research. These programs are in existence, but there's not much about what can museums offer young children. So we know that they're coming to museums and these programs exist, but we don't have much information about what can museums specifically offer this age group. And there's also not quite so much written about what can children teach museums. So it's a give and take, as we always have in education. As an educator, we think about what do we give and how are we giving it, but then also how is it being received, and what can they how can they teach us? So that's something that I've been thinking about too, is what can we learn from children as an institution and as educators. And I've already addressed a little bit of the gaps in the research, but just in reading the literature, it's great that many object-based museums, like by object-based I mean art museums or history museums, where the focus is objects. Basically, a place where you can't touch things. You have to keep your hands to yourself. Those types of museums are object-based museums, which differ greatly from a tactile museum, let's say a children's museum or a science museum, where you're encouraged to touch things and you can climb on things and play. But there's evidence. There's a survey created by Betsy Bowers in 2012, and it was a survey of museums. And of these of 69 object-based museums, 57 of them claim to have programs for children under the age of 5, which is pretty large number. And by programs, I think that can mean a variety of things. It might not always be a long-standing program. It could be a one-time program. It could be a family program that is intended for a large swath of ages to come. But that being said, that's still a very large number of institutions that have programming for this age group. However, despite the fact that many of these museums offer these types of programs, there's very little literature about these types of programs. And of the existing literature that highlights specifically even art, early childhood programs in art museums, much of it is very helpful, and I know I've been doing the research and reading the literature. There's really wonderful literature, but the majority of it comes from the voice of the institution, which is very helpful because we can learn about their practices and we can learn about the transactions and what happens, but there's not quite as much about but the participants are gaining, or not quite as much about their own voices. So that's what I hope to do in my own research, is to have a layering of voices. So I do hope to hear from the perspective of the institution. I also hope to hear from the perspective of the educators who are teaching the programs, but also the participants, and to hear their own thoughts, perspectives, and what they might feel that they take home. Or what they gain from being part of this program. And then also, just to mention too, there's a great deal of research on museum education for older age groups as well. Some beautiful studies by NAEA, longitudinal studies, but a lot of these focus on elementary school and sometimes middle school students as well. So this brings me to my research question. So officially, I'm curious about what can an analysis of program observations, as well as responses from program educators, program administrators, and participants, tell us about the educational significance art museum programs hold for visitors ages 2 through 5. So again, I'm really looking at the layered responses. So from the institution, educators, and from participants. And basically, I'm curious about what do they gain? And here are my sub-questions. So how do these programs meet or not meet the needs of early learners described in the literature? So we talk about they're grabby. So how do you make a museum program that highlights the best attributes of a museum? Because we can obviously have really beautiful studio spaces and very hands-on, tactile studio experiences, but then you could do that in a community center. Why come to an art museum? So just finding this balance of how do we make the best use of the assets of what a museum can provide us and visitors of this age, but how do we do it in a way that that lets them be grabby too, and lets them be their best 2-year-old self in this space. And what other gains do participants garner from experiencing these programs? So maybe there's things that are not in literature that we'll be discovering about early learners as well. What is the relationship between the gains the programs offer and specific characteristics of these programs? So what is it that these educators are doing that, that might help? What types of actions or what types of materials do they offer that might help a child maybe gain something? And what new insights about early learners may be illuminated by this study? So again, maybe there's other things that we might learn about them in this unique space that could apply to other types of environments as well. We will see. And in terms of my conceptual framework, again, just really thinking about the fact that children learn differently from older children and adults. So as I learned the hard way, is what we do with older children might not always work with younger children. And also we do know, as some of you were sharing out loud, that children really learn best, and actually most of us do, learn best through play. and through social experiences. And this is really also based on the constructivist theory, just acknowledging that all learners, including very young children, come to an experience with their own knowledge and with their own history of past experiences, and just acknowledging that they have a lot to bring to the table to wherever they arrive, especially the art museum. And this is a qualitative study because I do not believe that a quantitative study could really allow me to understand the nuances of what's happening with students learning within this space. And again, I'm hoping to see the layered responses of educators and administrators. So truly, a qualitative methodology, a qualitative approach is really going to be most helpful. And also each program that I observe is essentially a case. So this is a multi-case study. And you'll see in just a second, yes, that I am observing, I'm focusing on programs in 3 different art museums, specifically in New York City. So first of all, I'm choosing New York City because that's where I am. It's convenient, but also there's such a richness in the variety of types of programs available to this age group. And I thought really carefully about how to choose these sites because I want a variety of sites. So I chose one institution where they have a long-standing program for early learners. Another institution where it's basically a brand new program, and I'm interested in seeing how they're developing it and maybe the challenges that they're facing. And I'm also choosing a third institution where it's kind of an in-between. It's not quite so mature program, but it's not as long-standing as the other. And also one thing I want to mention is that I chose in this study to make all the information or the names of all the institutions confidential, not to be mysterious or secretive, but the main reason is because when I conducted my pilot study, a number of the museum administrators and educators had a lot to share with me about their thoughts on the struggles of helping create a program that is so new, and they had some of their own challenges with their institutions, and I really wanted to have all participants feel comfortable sharing the positive and negative aspects of the journey that they face as they're working in these institutions, as they're creating these programs. So I really wanted them to feel really comfortable to share all their points of view, and then also another reason too is because I am not I'm not conducting this research on behalf of any particular institution. So I would like all participants to feel that that they can be open, especially the program participants, to just be open to share their honest thoughts about their experiences in the program, and to not feel that they have to give it a thumbs up or 5 stars, because I do not work for that particular institution. So I really just wanted to really get to the nuts and bolts of what is working behind these programs, and I felt that making it confidential would be the best way to do that. And also in terms of site selection, I really wanted to choose museums that are located in different parts of New York, very different types of museums in very different neighborhoods. All 3 of them are in different boroughs. One of them is a large type of encyclopedic museum. Another museum is a very small institution that's based in a smaller community. And another one is more of like a kind of contemporary space. So I tried to choose a variety of museums that serve very different communities as well. So I'm observing early childhood programs in 3 art museums in New York City, and I'm observing three sessions of the programs in each museum. So 3 in one, 3 in another, 3 in another. And within each institution, in addition to my observations, I'm conducting one interview with the manager of the program, or the person, in some cases the person who created the program, and I'm curious about why they created it, how, what are their hopes for the future for this program, and then In addition to that, I'm interviewing each educator every time they teach the program and having a reflection with them after each session. And finally, I'm conducting an interview with at least, and sometimes more, 2 families per session. So the program participants who were involved in the programs. And when I'm referring to families, this can mean many things. And actually these programs, they're described as family programs by the museum. Sometimes they're called intergenerational programs. This can mean many things. And this also means that, that these children often come to the museum with a caregiver who's not part of their, it might not be their parents, might be another type of caregiver. However, because it's the dissertation, IRB has told me that I can only interview children whose legal guardian is there. So for the ease of this, it would be very challenging to be able to have a non-parental caregiver or a non-legal guardian somehow call the legal guardian elsewhere. So for the purpose of this study, I am focusing only on the legal guardians who are able to sign the permission forms. So family can mean many things, but for the, oh my goodness, okay, so I'll skip forward. Just quickly, in terms of data collection, I've discovered that I'd like to add a few things as well. I'd like to add one in-depth interview with a participant of each program that has been involved in the program multiple times, because I realized I really want more depth. There's only so much you can get from an interviewee who is actually participating in one program at the time. Sometimes the program is only 1 hour long, so you're asking them questions reflecting on only maybe the last 40 minutes. So I really hope to have one in-depth interview with families. And another reason why I chose to start these in-depth interviews is because there's also stories that I've heard of participants from previous sessions that I have not actually been involved in, but I'm so curious about. Like, for example, I was just talking to a mother of one of the children who participated in these programs, and her daughter was, as she called, selectively mute. So her daughter had high anxiety when they would leave the home. And once this child began to participate in the early childhood program in this particular museum, she surprised her mother, and even in the middle of class, asked a guest speaker in the program a question. And this girl, this was her first time actually speaking out loud in public outside the home. And so her mother was so amazed by this. And so this is just one example, but with my in-depth interviews, I would like to speak to her and other families such as this to try to figure out what was it that was part of this program. Was it something that was part of this program that might have led to this change? Was it an action or some type of activity that happened within this program that might have led to this? Maybe it's something about the environment. So this is why I really hope to have a few more very in-depth interviews with families. And also I hope to just have a quick survey to add breadth to my data collection, to have more information from families who might have attended in the past, because I'm also curious what happens in the home after your program. Is there anything that maybe your family has done in response? What do you actually take home from this? And I'm almost done. I'm finishing up on I'm right now, I'm almost finished with my data collection. I just have a few more interviews to go, but just I'm noticing a few early themes. So just one thing is I'm starting to notice some social skills that are, or at least evidence of social skills being demonstrated. So many of these children who participate in these programs do not attend formalized school. So for many of them, this is some of their first experience interacting with other children or other families in a formal setting. So I even heard from one parent in an interview who said, before this, I just hadn't seen her engage with other kids. So just being in this environment is allowing them to interact with one another. I see children connecting with one another. Some of this is by design, by some of the educators, encouraging children to do turn-in talks or to even welcome one another into the room by name. And also cross-family engagement. So educators have designed these lessons to have families even share materials. So it's intended to have, for every other family, to have one tray of materials. You're then forced to talk to other families. So this is kind of demonstrating some social skills. Also, something that many of us who've taught art making with children already know, that there are so many physical discoveries to be made, and the excitement that happens when you're working with materials and experimenting with materials. And then also some verbal skills are coming about as well. As we're looking in the galleries, children are able to build their vocabulary, saying out loud, identifying the qualities of different objects that they notice, colors, textures. And then also something I'm noticing as an early theme is it's not just about the kids, it's also what's happening in the museum is also kind of modeling behavior for some of these caregivers as well. And like, for example, there's one parent who said about his child, he even learned how to bring the glue to the table himself here. So the educators could have easily given each child their glue at their table, but by design, they intended for children to come retrieve the glue, bring it back, and this is just kind of modeling that this type of thing can happen in all different types of settings, is teaching independence through use of materials. So these are just some overall themes, but just on one quick last kind of ending note, is that these types of things that you can learn about discovery through materials, about your body in space in a gallery, these types of social experiences that I just mentioned, these things are great, but they could also happen at Chuck E. Cheese. They could happen, you can take your child to Chuck E. Cheese, they could have a sensory experience, and I'm sure they'd have fun. So what I'm really thinking about overall, now that I'm starting to code my data, is thinking about why bring your child to a museum? How is this experience for your child different from, say, another environment? And just on a final note, what I'm starting to realize is that, as I'm kind of reading through the lines in my data, is that we're kind of learning that a museum is a place where children are welcome. We're hoping to have people feel welcome. So by design, I'm noticing some of these actions and some of the words that educators are introducing in these programs is their focus is trying to welcome the families. And then also some of these actions and the way these lessons are designed is that they're trying to create a space where children and families want to revisit. And then also that it's a place where you can grow. You can, when you go to Chuck E. Cheese, it's really fun, but you can't come when you're much older. But we're trying to demonstrate this is a place where you can come when you're 2. It's a place you can come when you're 10. It's a place you can come when you're adult, and we will adapt to your needs as much as possible and try to welcome you wherever you are, despite your age and your abilities. Yeah, okay. And then finally, we're just trying to, I'm noticing through the data that the museums are trying to establish a space for families in their own community. And there we go. Thank you so much. Sorry, I ran over. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Johnson, and I'm from Teachers College. I'm a doctoral student in my third and a half year, because I started midway, so it's kind of hard to place myself. But I've been investigating this topic. This is something I knew I wanted to investigate as soon as I applied, because it's coming from a very personal place, and you'll hear a little bit about that. So my topic on that note is early career art education faculty members, professional tensions as catalysts for growth. And I'm currently at the very initial stages of data collection and even still recruiting participants. So I will really be essentially presenting the plan. So it's my dissertation proposal. No data yet, but we're getting there. So I'll start with some definitions to clarify exactly who and what I will be talking about. So I'm defining an early career collegiate art teacher educator in this study as an art education faculty member working in an institution of higher education whose responsibilities really focus on preparing prospective art teachers in theory and pedagogy. So, teaching methods courses, supporting field experiences such as student teaching. I know that there are several people in the room who fit this description, but I'm focusing on the early career stage, so I need to go ahead and really define or talk about how I'm delimiting that term. So the early career stage, according to much of the literature, there's a lot of variation on exactly how wide a band that sort of encompasses, but for the purposes of this study, I'm limiting it to the first 3 years in the role, and I'm really limiting it to full-time experience, not adjuncts, and I'll discuss why in just a bit. So teacher education scholars Trevor Murray and Jean Mail, in a 2005 study of beginning teacher educators, concluded that it took up to 3 years, so there's support in the literature, for teacher educators to establish an identity specifically as teachers of teachers, and that the process was long and sometimes difficult because feelings of professional unease and discomfort were particularly acute, especially when the substantial, that is the core stable self, the person of the teacher educator, and the situational self, the self in a specific role, were felt to be or seen to be distinctly out of alignment. So elements being out of alignment speak to the concept of tensions, which is what I'll talk about next. The notion of tensions that I refer to throughout this presentation comes from dialectic theory. And dialectics have to do with things being in opposition or contradictions. So professional tensions, as I'm defining them, are the tugs and pulls or the push and pull experiences that we feel and we experience as a result of the existence of contradictions that arise in the context of our work lives. So specifically, feelings of ambivalence, surprise, doubt, difficulty, or puzzlement that emerge from contradictions between, among, or within the art teacher educator's professional life. So often there are tensions between values, expectations, priorities, and goals that art teacher educators bring to the work, and values, expectations, and demands that are held by other people with whom they interact and are accountable to, and even with values, expectations, priorities, and demands that are embedded in the policies, whether written or unwritten, of the institutions in and with which they work. However, there can also be conflicts within the art teacher educator, him or herself. So these are intrapersonal tensions where the person might hold two or more disparate seeming values or priorities together, but be pulled towards one in one, at one time and towards the other at another time, depending on the situation and the dynamics. So I'm going to share a little bit of my story of becoming an art teacher educator because it is relevant. It does contextualize my positionality as a researcher, and it does set up the background to my research problem. I did my undergraduate art education in Jamaica as a painting student, and Jamaica is my home country. And after that, I went to Massachusetts and did master's degrees in fine arts and art education. And while in Massachusetts, I gained experience teaching undergraduate studio courses and a little bit of experience teaching at the middle school and high school levels, teaching art, clearly. A few years later, I returned to Jamaica and began teaching art education courses part-time at the art school where I had been an undergraduate. And after 1 year, I was promoted to the full-time position and role of head of the art education department in the context of sudden, unexpected events that created the need for someone to serve in this capacity. And I'm aware that this is not your typical situation, especially if you think about the tenure process and how it works in higher education. So I just have to declare that. And I found that my new role had within it several sub-roles and responsibilities, and I'm sure those who are art teacher educators can definitely relate. I'm assuming that this is not just my experience. And I felt really overwhelmed. I felt like I had been thrust in because of the particular circumstances that surrounded my entry into teacher education as a teacher educator. So because I was now asked to take on administrative roles, to coordinate student teaching, I didn't know what I was doing. I needed to supervise student teachers. I had some experience to draw from because I had done some K-12 teaching and some studio teaching at undergraduate level, but none of it kind of connected well enough for me to be able to make sense of now teaching prospective art teachers about teaching art, because that was a whole different, more complex enterprise. So I was dealing with that transition shock, but I was also dealing with cultural dissonance between my own education as an artist and art teacher, the bulk of which took place in Massachusetts, and the practice of teaching pre-service art teachers in Jamaica. Because although I am a Jamaican, proudly so, and I was educated in Jamaica up to a particular point, I had never navigated the education system there as a teacher, much less a teacher-educator. I was also experiencing conflict between what I knew and what I realized I needed to learn, so maybe that's a pedagogical conflict. So as I spoke a little bit about that before, about not teaching kids and adolescents not being the same as teaching adults about teaching a subject. And also I experienced role-related or identity tension, status-related tension, identity crisis a little bit, because I felt in my situation that the way I positioned myself was as somebody who needed to develop and to kind of grow and be supported in my experience, but yet I was positioned by others as somebody needing, part of your job. You are supposed to be the one to support and help other people and develop your prospective art teachers and change the world. So that, no pressure. So my positionality, therefore, is as an insider to the phenomenon being studied, but I do intend to use my personal experience strictly in a reflective way to try to kind of distance the insider self a bit so as to not have it impose on the data collection and the presentation of data. I'm really more interested in what others have experienced because I feel as though being in that experience and sharing that story, I have a lot of assumptions, and I'm really curious to find out whether my experience translates or what's similar and what's different. So how does my experience then connect to the wider background of teacher educators' early experiences? So several teacher educators whose experiences are described in general teacher education research express feeling overwhelmed, same as I did, with multiple largely unforeseen responsibilities and expectations and demands and dimensions of their role that are far more nuanced and quite different than what they had anticipated. So a common report from new teacher educators really echoes my own experience, that the reality of teaching, which becomes teaching about teaching or fostering adult learners learning about teaching, is vastly different than teaching a subject to children and or adolescents, even though there are overlaps because teaching is teaching and there's common content knowledge at the core. But furthermore, teacher education scholars assert that there are assumptions that are subconsciously integrated into the culture of schooling at all levels and into the public consciousness to an extent about the nature of educating teachers that position the new teacher educator's initial dilemmas as unimportant or unproblematic. And those assumptions include the teacher educator being an expert teacher or a subject matter expert coming out of their previous experience. And that would mean that they can immediately just translate and transfer everything they learned and build wonderful teachers. So that's why it says, there's an assumption that teacher education is a self-evident activity. There's not much, you just transfer. And I'm not saying that that's a very, very common assumption, but it's out there. And it does sort of put the position of the new teacher educator, it sort of creates a problem because it doesn't see it as problematic. So there are numerous tensions, clearly. I think I've established that. And some of the factors that influence those tensions, apart from what I've said before, are that the teacher-educator role, teacher educators have a meta role. They're teaching about teaching, and your work is layered. You're not just working with the university, but you're accountable to a whole host of other stakeholders. So you're accountable to your students, you're accountable to the schools in which your students learn to teach, the teachers there, I do have like a list, so I should refer to that. Professional bodies and accreditation bodies, but there's a whole host. So because it is so layered, it means that they have to themselves be aware of and engaged with the continuously increasing demands and issues in the field, as well as prepare their students to face these issues and contend with them and make change where change is needed. Also, for most, the requirements for becoming tenured or permanent present additional pressures to gain a high-quality research publication record, to document evidence of excellent teaching skills and excellent student evaluations, to contribute service to the university and the surrounding community and to the field at large. So those are some of the forces that sort of create tensions, or forces that that create a dilemma. So while there are empirical studies that speak to the general experience of being new teacher educators, and even the non-art education research that exists is still it's still a young genre of research. There's not all that much out there, and it hasn't been out there for very long. And limited research exists regarding the specific challenges and tensions that new art education faculty members contend with. But art education scholar Lynn Galbraith, well, Lynn Budare now, she was Galbraith, but she's been doing this work for a long time. She is really the primary person who's done work and really has put the art teacher educator as a subject of focus in research. Because much of the research that exists about art teacher education or teacher education in art focuses on pre-service teachers and the contexts rather than the teacher educator. So she states, Budare states, that art teacher educators are missing persons in literature. She cites John in saying that. But in a 2005 book chapter, she further comments, quote, "Our pedagogical work is rarely observed and documented by others, especially by other art educators within the field," unquote. And I find that really significant because we experience these things, but we don't talk about them, we don't share, and there's not really that much on the record about how we contend, what are the things that we specifically contend with, what are the common things that we contend with, how do we all respond to them, what is the thinking that accompanies all of these experiences. So the problem is, in part, as these quotes by Ritter and Cuenca and McNulty tell us, that newly hired collegiate art teacher educators are required to develop a new professional identity, and I'll extend that to include practice, while engaging in the practice of being a teacher educator for the first time, or at least full-time first time. And that requires them to simultaneously reconcile the unfamiliarity of the position, the discomfort of redefining their identities and practices, and the demands of preparing successful teachers. So the problem is, in short, that new art teacher educators experience a learning curve that is often much more challenging than is given credit or attention. And the fact that these experiences are largely undocumented in our field sort of ignores, or at least doesn't give enough credit to, the reality that new knowledge needs to be constructed in order for people to understand their work and its dimensions and the scope of it, and to feel competent in doing it. I don't want to say feel competent in doing it, because I'm going to just put out there that I'm not assuming that my experience, even though I sort of struggled with these things, is everybody's experience. We understand that it's relative. So it's therefore a problem that involves constructing new knowledge of how to teach and learn simultaneously the pedagogical content knowledge of art teacher education, as well as other aspects of your broader role as a professor that go beyond teaching teachers. So you're practicing these things while you're learning about them, which is what makes it so challenging. So how do you teach teaching? You're learning that, you're figuring that out while you're doing it. And then how do you teach art education content, which is its own thing, while you're kind of figuring out what this pedagogical content knowledge of what you're doing right now really is. So the pedagogical content knowledge of art teacher education that an art teacher educator cultivates or would need to cultivate would involve knowledge of ways of locating or constructing discipline-specific practices and principles that are true to the nature of art and design and visual culture, and also that align with the art teacher educator's own values, personal and professional values, and that are culturally and developmentally appropriate for children and adolescents, as well as pre-service teachers to learn. So the difficulty of I really struggled to articulate that, and I think that kind of speaks to the fact that it's really not unproblematic and does need some attention. So there's a desire and a need to understand the ways that new knowledge for practice is constructed in the situation of being in this sort of gray space or tension-filled space by art teacher educators. And there's a need to understand as well how a deeper understanding of oneself, one's role, oneself in the role, and of art teacher education practice can emerge out of examining gray areas and tensional situations. Hong, Falter, and Fetchel, dialogic communication scholars, support this idea, saying that, quote, "By identifying and unpacking tensions, we can better understand the complexities of the classroom," unquote. And I extend this to the broader social environment of the university and the experience of adjusting to one's role or roles within it. So my research questions. So first, what types of tensions do early career art teacher educators identify in their professional practices? Secondly, what contributing factors do they attribute to the tensions they experience? I'm really interested in what the relationships are, if any, among their academic and professional backgrounds. I don't have it in the question, but their identity, their stances, their current work situations, and the tensions that they identify and contend with. Thirdly, how do they articulate, demonstrate, and rationalize the choices they make in negotiating and or managing the professional tensions they contend with? And fourth, what will they learn through negotiating/managing these tensions that are salient in their experiences? And how might their choices and strategies and thought processes that they employ become integrated into their purposes and practices as art teacher educators? To guide my approach to analyzing the first research question, which is what types of tensions do they contend with, or identify first, I should say, what types of tensions do they identify, I thought it would be useful to clarify what aspects of the art teacher educator role likely constitute categories or contexts of professional tensions. So I synthesized findings from a number of scholarly frameworks that concern contexts in which dilemmas and tensions arise in professional life. And from that synthesis, I identified these 7 general categories or contexts in which tensions arise. So before I'll go through them just very, very briefly, but one thing I should say is that all of these overlap. There's not one thing that's going to arise that's going to just be a cultural tension or a political tension. So you have role, status, identity-related tensions, and I think I gave you an example from my own experience of that. Political or micropolitical tensions, which have to do with power relations and dynamics within an institution or with conflicting power relationships between institutions, whether the institution is as grand and macro as the education system or as micro as a program or something smaller. Cultural tensions, whether that be tensions between or within personal cultures, teaching cultures, and other types of cultures. Conceptual tensions, which have to do with knowledge bases and what is considered to be most worth knowing in a discipline, such as art or art education. Interactional tensions, which have to do with relationships in general, so relationships between the art teacher, educator, and students, art teacher, educator, and administrator, art teacher, educator, and cooperating teacher, and the list goes on. Intrapersonal, I think I talked about that earlier as well, where you hold 2 conflicting values or more in contention within yourself. And pedagogical, clearly having to do with teaching. So I thought it would be really useful, not that I intend to use this as a way to just drop things in and say, well, this is that type of tension and that type of tension, but it would be useful just to look at the literature and see how anything that might arise in maybe the interpretation of the findings, how I could line it up with what exists out there and what other scholars have found. But even without like the impetus to use it in analysis or interpretation, I thought it would be useful just to look at them side by side and see what are the contexts and categories. So just to illustrate the fact that there's no one category that any tension can fit in, I thought it would be useful to give an example. So if we find a tension that is, we name it established practices versus new or different practices or new ways of learning, thinking, and doing, and that's a tension, that could be a micropolitical tension, because if those established ways are entrenched in an institution's policies, written or unwritten, it becomes political. It's pedagogical if it has to do with teaching, and it really is a tension that can be coded in the broader category of stability versus change. And that's one of 3 broad categories developed by Leslie Baxter and Barbara Montgomery, who developed relational dialectics theory. So the first 3 categories up there, stability versus change, integration versus separation, and expression versus privacy, are the broadest categories that you'll find all the literature that talks about tensions. At some point, something is going to fall into those categories. And I do have others that emerge from other literature. I'm not going to go into them right now in the interest of time. So my theoretical framework, I'm just trying to think through and communicate how I'm thinking about analyzing the 3rd and 4th research questions. All the research questions, of course, would apply. But since I'm looking in the 3rd and 4th research questions I'm looking at thinking through tensions and the learning that occurs through that process, I rely on these 3 theories. Relational dialectics, which I just mentioned, is a communications theory and has to do with relationships, but it's been used in a lot of other fields to analyze dilemmas and tensions. So it's relevant. Amanda Berry, who's an Australian art teacher educator, wrote a book that has the title Tensions in Teaching About Teaching, and she identified 5 tensions that are specific to being a teacher educator. And they've been coded in that matrix that I showed you. So I'm not going to go into what those are right now. Also, creative tension is relevant because Parker Palmer identified 6 paradoxical tensions of pedagogical design, and he impresses upon us that tension is absolutely necessary in order for effective pedagogy to take place and for creative activity to happen. And his ideas are also echoed by Peter Senge. I've considered constructivism in relation to teacher educators' professional learning, and I'm interested in the ways that practical knowledge or know-how is developed in the context of experience or practice. So educative experience, John Dewey's theory, situated learning, etc., are other strands of constructivism that are relevant to my study. So how does the art teacher educator who is new, through examining tensions, create practical knowledge in a situation wherein he or she connects prior knowledge to new contexts, and how is that experience educative? Reflective practice is the third theory. I'm using Donald Schoen's framework of reflection in action and on action. Reflection in action being thinking or deciding in a moment towards clarifying and or working through a salient but indeterminate or murky problem. Not that we're expecting a resolution. I'm not expecting that through my research we're going to come up with solutions. I'm really more interested in the thinking. A reflection on action is clearly a reflection that takes place after an act or an event. And reflection for action is an extension of Schoen's theory by Killian and Tottenham that takes the first 2 types of reflection and puts them into consideration towards future actions. My methodology is qualitative. I'll be using the case study approach and doing multiple case studies. So each participant, and I'll be having 6 participants, that's my aim. So each participant and his or her situatedness within a context of professional practice, a bounded system, as Cresswell calls it, constitutes a case. I'll be using a phenomenological lens to collect data and to apply to the analysis of the data because I would like to be able to understand the meaning and essence of the experience of being a new art teacher educator as it relates to each specific individual and not generalize. I'm really interested in the individual dynamics and thinking and the meaning of the experience. I'll be using the narrative method, not as a method of collecting data or analyzing it, but simply as a way of presenting the cases. So my participants, as I said, I'm looking for 6, I've gotten some already, but 6 first-time, full-time, early career, higher education-based teacher educators, art teacher educators who, as we said, 0 to 3 years experience, you know the work they do. They represent varied demographic profiles and backgrounds and institutions. So I want to talk about that just for a sec. I think in addition to considering prior academic experience and professional experience, it's really important to look at who the person is culturally, value-wise, where they work, the kind of program and where our education program is located within a particular institution, because it could be in a school of art, and that would be very different than being in a school of education, because the perceptions of our education definitely vary. And those kind of factors might create different kinds of tensions than just academic and professional experience. So I'm trying to consider as much diversity as possible in this. And the last limitation or the last stipulation would be to work in the Northeast United States. And that's because I really want to go and observe them in practice. But these criteria are flexible because I'm finding that there's not that many people who fit these very specific criteria. So just saying that. So collection of data. I have 2 questionnaires. First, a participant profile to get demographic data, teaching philosophies, goals, so I get an idea of their values and what they bring. A second questionnaire that has open-ended prompts, where it's functioning sort of as a pre-interview or a written interview to prepare them for, just to give them some space to think before I talk to them, to identify tensions and think through them. So 3 semi-structured interviews with each participant done over 3 months. And I wanted to space them out, even though 3 months is really not that long. If you're dealing with tensions and you're experiencing the tensions, you don't really have much time to reflect and make sense of them in that short time span, so that's a potential limitation. But I wanted to space them out to give time to reflect in between, and also because I wanted to structure the interviews, which I've done, the protocols, based on the reflection in, on, and for action framework. Observations, I just want to observe them for a workday, a typical workday, not asking them to do anything different, just to contextualize what I see and what I hear. Visual elicitation response as another method of thinking through tensions, not necessarily writing and requiring too much, but using an artistic and arts-based method, and my reflective notes. So the data will be analyzed inductively, coded inductively. I'll be doing both within case analyses and cross-case analysis. So my narrative presentation that I mentioned before will be to present each case individually. So the participants in work context, and when I've identified particular individual distinctive tensions and responses, so I can put that into a larger narrative for each person. The cross-case analysis, really to just locate similarities and differences across the whole data set and emergent themes that come up, and they'll be presented thematically and supported by participants' quotes. Finally, my anticipated educational implications. I think the outcomes of this research should add to the research knowledge base about what it means and requires to be a new art teacher educator or an early career art teacher educator in higher education. And it may provide greater understanding of the following things. So specifically, the challenges of being a faculty member in higher education in art education, since the discipline-specific work is not really out there yet. And I feel that, being a science teacher educator, the content knowledge and the context is completely different than it would be for an art teacher educator. Also, I think the ways that teacher educators construct new knowledge for practice through reflecting on tensions that arise in their practice will be useful knowledge for the field, just in terms of the thinking that comes through and the individual ways of processing information and strategizing. Also, where and why tensions may arise from based on who you are and what you bring philosophically, what you bring as knowledge, as assumptions, as identity, as purpose, etc. to the role, and how all of that interacts with your work situation. So being an art teacher educator in your specific work environment and working with all the situational and interpersonal dynamics that apply there. There'll be things in common, I'm pretty sure, but very distinct experiences and learning that will be very enriching to other teacher educators as well as the persons themselves. I think this will be a reflective space for the individuals involved, but I think it has broader implications outside of their own experience and learning. And following on that, fourthly, and finally, not finally because I think there are more implications, but finally for this purposes of this presentation, ways that other art teacher educators who are already in the field may, I had the word intervene, but I'm struggling with that, but may collaborate or mentor or support new art teacher educators through this experience. And perhaps even in doctoral programs, because I'm aware that, and master's programs, because I'm aware that there are programs such as there's experiences here at OSU, at Teachers College and other places that really do have coursework, experiences, internship opportunities that do prepare people, graduate students, for the work of teacher education. But I'm not finding in my research that that's a widespread thing. So I think that has an implication there as well. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thanks for sticking around till the end. My name is Matt Capezzuto. I'm also from TC. This is based on my dissertation work. It's kind of an odd title. Hopefully I'll get to explain that later on. The Several Hands of Johannes Whistler. So this the whole thing is kind of based around a single object, a single artifact. I don't know why I'm holding this. It's called the Book of Arithmetic Problems of Johannes Whistler. This is an artifact in the American Folk Art Museum in New York City. And just briefly, I'll explain that it's a ciphering book. It's called a ciphering book. Has anybody heard of a ciphering book? A few people? Oh, great. Okay, so it's essentially a math notebook, as the title kind of indicates. Ciphering was a tradition of math education that began around the 12th century. And it really began with kind of mercantile capitalism and the arithmetic that's used, the kind of curriculum of arithmetic is based on a lot of things that were borrowed from North African and Middle Eastern nations that were doing trade with Europeans. So this tradition continued through Europe through Europe and also was brought to the Americas from that, from about the 12th century to the middle of the 19th century. So the book that we're looking at here is from the early 19th century, 1814 to 1815. And I should also explain that a ciphering book, it's also evidence of a person's education. So it'd be kind of like a resume or a diploma, something that shows somebody else what you learned. Not only for math, but also, as you can see here, a lot of these ciphering books were written in really beautiful script. So problems that were worked out on a piece of paper elsewhere would have been transferred to the book to show the person's education. This one is by a Pennsylvania German person. He was 20 years old, about 19 to 20 years old. Oh, wait, I didn't want to show you that yet. But so the reason that I came across this book, I was a teaching fellow at the Folk Art Museum, and I was looking for work by adolescents. I kind of didn't know what I was going to do there as a fellow, so I was just like, oh, I'll just start looking for work by adolescents. And this is what I came across. Now, the kind of background behind that, why I was interested in working with something by adolescents, is that I had been teaching adolescents in an out-of-school program for about 6 years at that point. And I had done a pilot study. I noticed that in the studio that we worked in, students from previous years had drawn on the walls and written on the walls, and the owners of the studio didn't really care, they didn't stop them, and I just thought it was kind of cool to see the history of the studio written on the walls. And so I kind of made an artificial situation of this. I painted out a wall, and I just told my current students, I basically just put a sign up and I said, you can do whatever you want, you can draw on this wall, whatever you want. And for a period of 2 weeks, I documented the kind of layering, the things that happened. And what I was expecting was this kind of collaboration, a kind of what Brent Wilson's called like communal graphic play. These different students interacting with each other on the wall. So as you can see, this is just a few of the details of the wall. You'll see here, like if you're familiar with memes, you'll recognize a few of them, right? So we have SpongeBob and this kind of confused math, I think it's called the confused math lady meme or something. You have Lenny, that's me, that's a caricature of me. And then we have, this is just another example of anybody, I can't remember the name of this guy. It's
not Lamar Burton, is it?
No, Roll Safe, right? Has anybody heard of that? He's like the British TV show. So the meme is usually like his face. He's always doing that, and then it's like something that's supposed to be clever, but isn't really. But so my student wrote, you don't have to do your project if you doodle on the wall, kind of like avoiding this project. So I was interested in how the students they kind of intuitively did these things in this that are dependent on the social context of the studio, and they kind of intuitively did kind of what the ancient Romans did with their graffiti, like having this kind of public forum. And so some of those ideas, they kind of stuck with me. Another thing was the kind of transference from one medium to another, like the digital medium to the wall. And that kind of easy transference that they kind of just did naturally was kind of fascinating to me, because they also made that kind of connection, that kind of analogical connection between the internet and this just physical wall in their space. So I was thinking about those things as I kind of fell in love with this book, and it took me a while to kind of figure out why I was falling in love with this book. And it was actually my advisor, Judith Burton, who also kind of pushed me to figure out why I cared about this book so much. Whistler, the author, the creator, was a Pennsylvania German, as I mentioned. His ancestors were likely from Switzerland. So Pennsylvania German is like Pennsylvania Dutch. It's the same thing. It's just people from German-speaking countries. He was likely a Mennonite. And so you can see a lot of the illustrations in the book, the illuminations, are in what we call the style of Fraktur, which is the kind of Pennsylvania German tradition of illuminating manuscripts. So there are a lot of different kinds of manuscripts that Pennsylvania Germans used in their social context, like family bonds, religious affiliations, and education. On the left there you have a baptismal certificate. That was a really typical kind of Fraktur document. And on the right, you have a writing specimen, something that a teacher typically would use to educate their students, or they would actually give them to their students to educate them in writing. And often these examples of writing had religious connotations to, like Bible passages. And I just want to show you a few examples of what the rest of the book looks like. So at the Folk Art Museum, typically you would see just like this kind of page, you know, the really pretty full page illustrations. But I took a look at the rest of the book. They let me look through the entire book. I also photographed the whole book. And most of the book is like this, math problems in about 2 columns per page. And then on the top of each page you have the heading, which is kind of beautifully illuminated. And so throughout this book it just has a lot of these kind of very intricate, very highly decorated headings. Sometimes you have little drawings. So there's a bear and a bird down there. This one has a particularly large and ornate heading. And so I was thinking, you know, there's so much more to this book than just the drawings. And I started getting more interested in the writing. And I just wanted to know more about who was this person and like why did he do what he did? What was motivating him to decorate the book in this way, or to engage in writing or in mark making in these ways? And so the way that I'm going about writing this story is actually kind of multiple stories, entangled storylines of this same artifact. So taking this artifact and looking at it from different perspectives. One in the hands of Whistler himself. How did he use the book? How did he come to create it? One from the field of, second from the field of Fraktur studies. So I'll talk about in a little bit how Fraktur studies came about and why it's a thing. And then also in my imagination. So projecting like what could this book be? What could the significance of this book be for creators? I have a background in painting. I'm an artist myself, so it kind of gets my creative juices flowing, so to speak. So my research questions are: how and why has the identity of Whistler's book as an artifact of creative processes transformed over time? So why was it one thing at one time and something else now? And looking back into the artifact's history, what are some of the implications for art makers today? And what does a deep study like this artifact suggest for art education? So in kind of theorizing the structure of these storylines, I took both a historical research approach and then also incorporating creativity theory, and in particular distributed creativity of Vlad Glavianu. And so this is Glavianu's, this is a diagram of his distributed creativity framework. It kind of begins with the assumption that creativity is not isolated in a single mind, in the brain of the creator, but arises through interactions among actors or artists, audiences, material and socio-cultural affordances, and artifacts. and through action that occurs over time. So it's just a progressive, continual interaction among these things. Glavianu, he stated that it points not only to the role of social relations, but also to interaction with artifacts and development over time for creative expression. And I like to think about it also, if you're familiar with Howard Gruber, his evolving systems approach is kind of like that, but decentralizing the act of creativity from the individual to a larger network. And Glavianu also, in his dissertation work, he focused on folk art as well as a site of distributed creativity. And so emphasizing that using folk art as the site of study emphasizes that long trajectory, that historical trajectory. With regard to historical research, I'm relying on Hayden White's theory of history, that it's kind of like a postmodern approach to history, that it's a selection of events evident in material traces woven together into a purposeful narrative. So acknowledging that I am selecting events and kind of orchestrating them in a way to tell a story. And I got that, I reached White through, I should acknowledge, the education historian Petra Monroe Hendry. And so these are some of the sources I'm using for my historical research. Whistler's book, of course, other Fracter ciphering books, letters by Whistler, and also letters from people who have found his book and written about his book. Secondary sources on Fracter and folk art studies, the history of Pennsylvania German Society, handwriting, ciphering, and biographies. And then part of the historical research is also codicological research, like treating Whistler's book as a historical document, and treating it in what Delassay called the archaeological approach, meaning that you look at the book as a whole, not just its contents, but also how the contents interact with each other, how they're laid out on the pages. That's something that Calkins applied when he studied medieval manuscripts. And then I kind of played around with this idea of the book as a portmanteau. So portmanteau is a French word. It means like a piece of luggage. What was that? I'm sorry. Oh. It's like a briefcase or something. Something that
It's like carry-on luggage.
Yes, thank you. Carry-on luggage. So in some way the book is like that, carry-on luggage, because it's leather bound, it's portable, it's personal, it carries things. Portmanteau also means like two words that are combined, like brunch, what's another, smog, things like that. What's that?
Webinar.
Webinar, thank you. So these are not terms that make one word, but these are terms that are combined through the book. Fracter and ciphering, private and shared, the act of handicraft and arithmetic, all are kind of combined in this single artifact. And so this is kind of a map of, taking that axis of temporality that was on Glavianu's diagram and mapping out essentially the relationship between Whistler's book and things that happened before and things that happened after. I'm kind of putting Gell's theory of retention and protension, which he gets from Edmund Husserl. This idea that an artifact anywhere in history can be a retention of artifacts that came before it, or it can be a protension of artifacts that come later. So it's kind of, he uses it primarily to talk about the work of a single artist, but I'm applying it to this more distributed framework. And so from this diagram, you'll see here Mercer's survival of a medieval art, ... So Henry Chapman Mercer was actually the first person to acknowledge fracture as this kind of thing that could be studied from the kind of modern scientific lens. So Mercer, as you can see here, born in the mid-19th century. He was born to a family of means. He went to Harvard. He became an archaeologist early on in the field's creation. So his earliest interests in archaeology was to discover who were the first inhabitants of the Americas. And he just never really discovered anything of any importance. Everything kind of ended up in a dead end. So he switched gear and he started studying artifacts from the early part of the early 19th century. So kind of dividing history into kind of pre-industrial and industrial eras. And so let me back up. Okay, so Mercer was from Pennsylvania. He grew up in Doylestown. He lived in Doylestown his whole life. That's also in eastern Pennsylvania. And so the artifacts that he started collecting were things from that area, so very localized. So a lot of Pennsylvania German artifacts, tools, things like that. He just amassed a huge collection of these things. He built, this is his mansion, Fonthill, and he built a museum and also a pottery and tile works. So these are some of his pottery or his tile creations, ceramic tiles. And so what I'm trying to show here is that Mercer went from being someone who was, he studied these things, he collected these things, and then he turned it toward creating something, physically making something. He was deeply involved in the American arts and crafts movement, and so that's kind of his agenda was to transform these things into generative, these artifacts into generative things for making new artifacts. So I just said all that stuff. So I get to go ahead. But the thing is that, so Mercer wrote the first pamphlet on fracture, and he describes it as being a retention of medieval manuscripts, so medieval illumination. But what later scholars discovered, particularly starting in the 1950s with Donald Shelley, was that there were a lot of antecedents to fracture that came after the Middle Ages, particularly printed books and printed broadsides. So for example, here we have writing, this would be like a writing copybook, handwriting copybook by Michael Bauernfeind. And so we see kind of round hand script, and also what this is on the right is also from his book. The whole book is printed in a typeface called Fracture. So if you're familiar with typefaces, you might recognize that. So Fracture is actually a black letter typeface. And that's where Fracture gets its name, the German documents. And here are some broadsides that this is kind of a commonly used example to show that Pennsylvania German fracture borrows from print culture. So this is called a wonderfish. It's kind of based on a myth that starts in Europe, but then it also continues on into Pennsylvania German fracture. And I haven't seen any really good descriptions of what the hell the wonderfish is, but you can kind of guess it's some kind of metaphor for war. It's kind of like a warning of oncoming war. That's what I get out of it. So even though Mercer was mistaken, he kind of plays a key role in how I started to imagine what I could do with this research. He's intrinsic to fracture studies in being its founder, but also instrumentally, he recognized the continuities between older artifacts and what could be created in his present time, and also using artifacts as generative engines for creation. And so in theorizing Whistler's book as a generative artifact, I started thinking again more about how it fits into the history of handwriting specifically rather than images, questioning the primacy of pictures over text, looking at handwriting as a physiognomic and affective process, and imagining handwriting and drawing on the same continuum. So I'm going to try to go a little faster. These are just a few examples of kind of antecedents to what would be Whistler's handwriting, this round hand script. And it's also, again, as I mentioned, in fracture studies, often the emphasis is placed on the pictures. But again, there's the word kind of dominates over picture, as Don Yoder, another fracture scholar, has said. And you could trace this back again to the fact that a lot of these were created in Protestant cultures, Protestant traditions. And so I also started to think about fracture not just as a group of objects, but as a kind of way of thinking, a mode of thinking about materials and about aesthetic creation. So just the materials, and also, these were functional objects, or objects that had currency in this society. So this is some of the research that I've been doing. I went through all 159 spreads, and I created a kind of visual representation of where flourishes occurred in the text. So I don't really have let me just flip ahead here to give you a little bit better view of some of his writing. So things like this were of interest to me, because he doesn't really use this kind of stylistic device often, but you see it in dry measures, and you'll see him using these kind of different styles with different words. And obviously I'm speculating here, but I thought it was fascinating the tactility of that line, and in association with the word dry. It feels kind of desiccated, kind of shriveled up. So again, that gets to the idea of this as being a physiognomic, something that, he's creating the line in response to some feeling as he's writing. Also thinking about handwriting and drawing as a continuum. Fracture is like this kind of ideal space, thank you, to see this intermingling of handwriting and drawing. And again, they're both kind of inspired by print culture. You can see that in the antecedents. And I like to think of both of them as being images in a way. They're both kind of coming from that same motive to make marks. Let me skip on here. This was a little show that I put together last year at Teachers College. And it was just a way to kind of place Whistler in juxtaposition with contemporary examples of handwriting as drawing, or drawing as handwriting. So here we have some scans from the poet Robert Grenier's drawn poems. Grenier is, he's a living poet, and most of his drawn poems are like this at the top. There'll be like 4 lines, very short poems, completely illegible to most audiences, but once you start getting to know his work and reading it over time, you become pretty familiar with his style, and then suddenly words start to emerge over time. So he's a really fascinating poet in that sense. And then these are actually two people that I know. They were convenient. This is my friend Carlos Martinez Ramos. He showed me his work from when he was in graduate school in 2011 and 2012, and I was just like blown away by these notebooks that he kept. And they have to do with these kind of almost these like divine experiences that he had, and I was just fascinated by how handwriting kind of is a record of these really felt experiences. And then this Christine Heindel is also, they're both painters. Christine was a professor of mine at Ohio University, and she works with these kind of word, I don't know if we call them puzzles, but they're kind of very enigmatic arrangements of words. And they have some connection to her painting. And so to finish up, I just wanted to kind of, again, I'm still working through these things, but these are kind of what I think the implications for art education might be. And one is to take time to unpack, again, like the portmanteau objects, these objects that might not quickly reveal themselves. So I'm also a museum educator. I teach at the Noguchi Museum. And so, sometimes we do programs where we spend an hour looking at a work of art. And so things like that, experiences like that, it kind of motivated me, as well as this research, to spend more time with objects. Also recognizing, like Mercer, the generative possibilities of handmade things, maybe using similar processes, or like with the exhibition I just showed you, trying to create connections across time. And then engaging in and elevating local material and visual cultural practices and histories. So I have a kind of a dream of supporting more local, smaller institutions that can draw more from local material culture and create kind of educational spaces for that. And also thinking about representation as distributed creativity. So things like virtual reality, or even writing about art, or photographs or video of art. Thinking about those things as extensions of the creativity of the work of art, so that we're really conscious of, aware of how those things are aesthetic and experienced artifacts themselves. That we don't just think of them as copies or kind of shorthand for something else. So we take them seriously as aesthetic experiences. And so I will end there. Thank you very much.
So we're a skosh behind schedule, so in the interest of time, we might keep our respondent questions brief and then open it to the whole group. So this is what I do. So one of the things that I was thinking about as each of you were talking about the work that you're doing is thinking about assumptions, like the assumptions that we make as teachers, the assumptions that folks like outside of our field perhaps make about the arts and arts education. And I really feel strongly, and I sort of trust that I'm not the only person in the room who feels this way, that those assumptions are really what serve to stagnate research and practice in the field, whether it be museum education or teacher preparation or K-12 education of our field. And so I wondered maybe if each of you could just sort of talk a little bit more about sort of assumptions in particular, because I think it's assumptions about our field that sort of led each of you to do the work that you're doing. So maybe talk about that just a little bit more, and maybe how you see your research as like really actively sort of combating some of those assumptions as an implication for the field?
Should I go first? Oh. Okay. Well, I think something that came to mind was maybe the assumption that there should be, that in any discipline there should be a more broad, like generalized study of things, and kind of like as if more is better, rather than maybe going deep into a particular object in my case. And so I think there are a lot of roadblocks throughout institutions that kind of inhibit our ability to go deeply within any particular subject or artifact. And for example, within curricula, the need to cover a lot of things in a short amount of time. But I think that the same attitude kind of permeates throughout. So like, when school groups come to a museum, sometimes they might expect to see a lot of stuff, or to get a really broad view of things. And of course, again, like time is always limited. So again, I think if there could be more opportunities to, as I said, to like unpack an object, to deeply engage in it, that would be something I would try to support. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I guess I have to think about this some more, even though I talked about some of the assumptions that I brought and that exist out there about the early experience. But I think this is something that was sort of undercover in what I was saying, that I feel like the fact that we're not talking to each other as art teacher educators and about the early experience, I feel as though it comes back to the assumption that this is a self-evident activity and that it's easy. And I think an implication of doing work like this that kind of investigates that experience and the tensions that accompany it, it humanizes the art teacher educator, because I think we're positioned as experts and we need to know what we're doing. We're not like saying, our hands need to be held all the way and that we should not be really excellent at what we do and know our stuff inside out. I'm advocating for that, but I feel as though that's a process that in order to get to that point where the knowledge is complicated. The knowledge you need to develop is a complicated type of knowledge, and it constitutes a whole lot, it covers a whole lot. And it has to be responsive, and it's not just something, you're not going to develop a codified matrix of pedagogical content knowledge, and it's not going to be something that's going to be systematic and just shared across the field. I think pedagogical content knowledge for each person, there are shared things, there are principles, there is knowledge that we must have, but I think there's also knowledge that is embodied, there's knowledge that is cultivated through experience, that is owned by the individual, and that will help the person to become an even better practitioner. Mm-hmm. And I'm really interested in, combating that assumption that this is just something that is prepackaged. You do your education, you come to the role already prepared, and you function.
Yeah, you're suddenly equipped to just do the thing.
Exactly. So I think it's humanizing.
And I think for me, in terms of thinking about early childhood education in museums, is really that it's not like Finney teaching. It's not one size fits all. So even though maybe one institution has found this excellent way of engaging their audience, it doesn't mean that it's going to work with another institution. So that's something that originally when I was personally as an educator struggling with what are some great ways to engage this audience, it was really wonderful to see how other institutions and how other educators discovered their own solutions, but it's not one size fits all. And what I've been finding is that every institution has its own community, its own neighborhood, also its own community of educators, its own culture. So it's really exciting through research and through conversations to discover what other institutions have found that work for them, but it doesn't mean it's going to work for you. But it can be an inspiration and a discovery, and you can figure out how to piece that together in your own way as an educator or as an institution. Yeah, thank you.
So I think we had similar tracks of thinking. So I'm going to switch my what I was going to ask a little bit. So one of the things that I was hearing all of you and thinking about the commonalities that I was seeing, I really appreciated that this idea came to me that you were all sort of unpacking or looking at structural understandings of the field in different ways, and looking at, so I was thinking about or visualizing like structural spaces and how we navigate them, or educational spaces. So I think your research is sort of adding to the scaffolding of the profession, and I appreciate that. So that's on a zoom out level, and then zoom in level I was thinking, oh, that's kind of a subtext, or is that a subtext of what you're studying? So I wanted to ask you if you see or are beginning to see, like, what are the, you've explained what the big picture of your research is, but can you talk about what you are starting to identify as the subtext in art or making, or in art education, or in museum education, or art teacher education?
I can go. So I think something that I've been discovering is kind of what I put in that last slide that I was trying to rush in there. I know I kept going on. But is really thinking about like the larger idea of how a museum can serve its community. So originally I was thinking about what children can gain, or these visitors can gain themselves by participating in these programs. And I was thinking about these little, like the great discoveries that these participants have found through their physical experiences with materials. And those things are really exciting discoveries for children and these types of skills that they're building. But something that I have been looking at just in the process of looking at my data is thinking about what does the institution of a museum necessarily mean for visitors? And so that's what I was kind of getting at. This idea is that I was talking about Chuck E. Cheese, but I mean it is why would we choose to bring these 2-year-olds to a museum when they'd have a great time at Chuck E. Cheese. They can still have these developmentally appropriate experiences, but in terms of we're thinking in a larger perspective that a museum hopefully can be a place for a community. And this is something that I've been reading between the lines of my data, is just that truly effective teaching for any educator, you're creating a welcoming space, a place where people want to come back, a place where they can be themselves. So I've been starting to see in my research that just this larger idea of what type of learning can a museum offer for its community, and how do we go about doing that? So it's not just the smaller learnings, but also what can we offer to the larger group.
Would you like to go? I have to think some more.
Well, I could maybe kind of continue that thought, like wondering what is a museum and what constitutes a museum. Just like thinking about what would a space look like that is educational, but also is based on object study, and that's also serving particular communities. But thinking about that at this moment, this kind of cultural moment, what does it mean what does a local community mean? Like, the communities are kind of always disrupted, always in flux. Certainly isn't the same as it was back in Whistler's time. So I think there's kind of a tension there, right, between kind of tradition and what is happening now, the kind of flux of community. And I don't know what I don't know what to say about that. But I'm interested in that complication between trying to look back in history and draw out some traditions, but also realize that new traditions may have come in from other places. So it's a question of what is the community and how do you best serve them, I think.
I'm not trying to opt out of the question, but I haven't collected any data yet, so it's kind of hard for me to see the subtext.
That's an honest answer.
Yeah.
I'm not going to actually ask this question, but what I really have been thinking about is like, what are the differences between museum spaces and Chuck E. Cheese? Like, you can learn at Chuck E. Cheese. There are artifacts at Chuck E. Cheese.
Sensory experience.
Yeah. Like, well, because Matt, you was like, well, how do we define museum spaces? And I was just like, I would define a museum space in a very similar way that I would define a Chuck E. Cheese space. So that can be post-dissertation.
No, exactly. And it's something that I'm considering is exactly like what makes a museum a museum and why would you bring a 2-year-old there?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really rich question. Also, I fundamentally disagree with your point that older children would not go to Chuck E. Cheese.
Oh, I know. Honestly, embarrassingly enough, I went there in high school with my friends. But yes, and I loved it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
Generally,
start with you there.
no.
Oh my God, what's this person going to say to me about my research? Really about Chuck E. Cheese.
No, I went there as a high school student.
Okay.
That's embarrassing.
So I think, all of the other questions that I sort of wrote down, we've sort of, between the two of us and your answers. So I would really like to turn it over to the folks who are here to see if there are questions, comments from y'all about this work. Yeah, Dana.
This is primarily probably for you two, but most specifically for you. So when you were talking about the ways in which museums might be welcoming people or the things that are happening now, one of the things that I was thinking in my own research, I've looked a lot at the positionality of our museum educators in a very gendered, hierarchical, institutional situation, right? And one of the things that I think has contributed to our museum education being sort of considered lesser than curatorial work is the fact that they do work with children and that they do work with young people like early childhood educators who are sort of on that lowest rung of teachers. Not that I think that, but this is a sort of stereotype. I think this has to do with pay. I think this has to do with, the ways in which they're perceived, their titles. So as you were going along, and I guess this is also a little bit for teacher educators too, right? As you were going along, did you find that the institutional sort of hierarchy or structures within the museum were supporting, you were talking about the reasons that these programs started. It was Sharon Schaefer, by the way, that's the name of the person who I worked with. I think it's SCTC. But so like, when you said that there was this sort of moment where there were more programs coming about, I guess I just wondered, there were a lot of external reasons that you thought these programs came about, but I was curious if you heard from any of them about their own staff, and then did anybody come to them and say, we need more early childhood education programs, and did they actually find the support that they needed to really make those programs go, or has that been part of your research at all?
Yeah, well, at least some of this has come about in my interviews with museum administrators. So a lot of the programs have come about because because I think I mentioned before, there was a gap. And it wasn't necessarily saying that, institutions specifically saying that we really want to foster education in this particular age group, but they realized they were addressing other populations, other ages, and they realized they want to include this as well. And then I think I also did mention that there was, from an institutional perspective, they realized there is sometimes money to be made from these programs. So that's another kind of institutional reason as well. But I do want to mention really quickly, though, that even though I know we're talking about like hierarchical perspectives, and but something I do want to mention, even though many of these programs were perceived as money-making programs for these museums, all three of the programs do accept this cool culture pass that they have in New York City. It's this cultural pass that often is given to families from Head Start programs. You don't have to be part of a Head Start program, but it's given to families throughout New York City, and it allows them to visit cultural institutions and dozens of museums all over the city completely for free, and they can even attend these specific programs. In fact, some of the families that I interviewed were there because of the cool culture pass. So yes, there are these hierarchical issues, but there are also opportunities to welcome families, hopefully a larger number of families from many different backgrounds. Yeah, I hope that kind of answers.
Yeah, I kind of thought of that a little bit too, about sort of the support that you're getting from early. I'm trying to remember how you said it. The teachers who were teaching what you said. the teacher educators who were early on in their careers, like the kind of support that they got. Sometimes research is given more support than that kind of teaching is necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you think about how the academy is set up, and I was talking about the tenure track, the tenure process, and the ranks of professors and how one has to go through that process. I mean, that certainly has a huge impact on what we're talking about. I feel like I'm fading, so can you repeat?
No, I was just interested in both contexts. If those educators felt like they had the support that they needed from their institution to actually continue to do that work. And I mean, you said they sort of touched on it. And again, it's not an external thing that I'm thinking about. It's purely whether or not the institutions actually supported them because they were working with children, which are not an audience that most people see as a huge moneymaker. Or in my own experiences in museums, there were times when I would sit down with a curator and we would talk about an exhibition, and I remember once this person, this is a little older, he said, I'm not sure I really care what a sixth grader thinks about this exhibition. I'm really glad I'm here because I really care what sixth graders think about this exhibition. So that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about, is whether or not, there's that ongoing or any support for the kind of, that you need to make a program stick.
No, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I specifically haven't heard anything necessarily about that, like any pushback from the institution as a whole. Luckily, I haven't heard anything about that. But something that I think is important to notice is that early childhood programs, as with all forms of education, but particularly early childhood programs, take a lot of hours to plan because there's many different materials, lots of different stations, there's constant involvement, so it actually does take educators a lot of time to prepare. So I've noticed that some institutions have recognized that, and they have agreed to pay educators more for working in these early childhood programs because they recognize that it takes a long time to create all these tools. So at least in definitely one and sort of another institution, it's been recognized that even though you're not teaching for a long period of time, that you're paid for the prep work, which is nice. So at least there's that recognition from the institution.
That's good. Yeah. I'll just take a quick stab at it. So, like I say, I'm in the position where I don't have the data, so I can only speculate, and I can reflect on my pilot study because I did interview 7 art teacher educators. 3 of them I asked to reflect on their early years, and 4 were early career. And they did mention that, they mentioned a lot of the politics and some of the expectations embedded in the role, which have to do with hierarchies and politics. And a lot of I'm not certain, based on those interviews, that ongoing support is really there. And if it's there, it's collegial, it's departmental, it's through friends and colleagues and people who allow them to sit in their classrooms and who they invite into their classrooms to give them feedback and support in that kind of informal way. And it's not necessarily from the institution. I feel like the institution puts pressure rather than, and then the colleagues help to relieve the pressure and to help them to figure solutions out. So I feel like that's an implication for, you know, what needs to happen in the future for that support to be sort of more built into the, you know, the fabric of the institution.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Thanks. Dave?
Okay, I hope this ends up in a question. But I've been thinking about like how all of the discussions are what's going on. And one of the things with both Jessica and Megan, you talk about, you know, working with these kids and this rawness of expression. And I think of them almost in this Lockean state, this natural state that have been unpropagandized and everything like that. And Matthew talks about community and having some sort of a, I think we all kind of talk about that. But one of the things I think about a museum space is both how we're taught to respond kind of intellectually, but in many times kids are showing what you really feel. Like if you really think about what you're feeling in a museum, you want to sometimes wiggle or scream or yell. But museum spaces also all have a voice. Okay, they've been curated, and there's been a lot of hierarchy and patriarchy and all of that stuff. Where is the space for us to confront this and allow that as a positive type of thing, where you are actually reflecting on, oh, this represents a view, and we want to we not only do we want to express in our own view, our own way, but we also want to show that, you know, there's history and there's burden maybe with some of those things in a museum or with the community, to kind of support that idea of a community that's reflective on why are we getting this kind of thing? Why are we told how to act? Or why are these things here?
I was going to say also in response to the previous question, or it was more of a comment, but if it were up to me, every curator would have to sit through a 6th grade tour and workshop like every 4 months or something. You know, like they should be responsible to every person that comes in and their reactions, because like you said, they're not just children's reactions, they're everyone's reactions. It's just children are the ones that are willing to like, you know, shake around and respond to those feelings. But we all have those feelings, they're all still with us. So yeah, I kind of feel like curators should be part of their job description to be there and learn from the education department. I'm sure there are no curators here that I'm offending, but
Yeah, and I think that's kind of also, I'm glad you asked, because that really kind of goes back to one of those questions that I was thinking about, is not just what are we, what is an institution providing to these learners, but also what can the institution learn from these children. And I think ultimately, even though I haven't finished all of looking through all of my data, I think ultimately it kind of goes back to this idea of universal design. I do have a history of working with visitors on the autism spectrum, also with museum visitors with dementia. And so it's really this idea of thinking about sometimes what's better for certain populations are also kind of better for all of us. Like you think about a ramp, is, you know, physically, even how do you get to a museum? Well, the ramp is great for all visitors. Why even have steps? And so I think that's kind of the same thing too, is thinking about universal design in terms of programming. I was talking about how having really tactile experiences were really helpful for early learners. Well, guess what? We all learn when we can feel the material, the same material that an object is made out of. We can use our bodies, we can use our hands, but I think it's a kind of a cultural shift that museums were originally built for maybe one type of population, or at least traditional art museums that we know of were built for one population, and now, at least programmatically, we're trying to welcome more larger groups of people, different types of learners. And so it's not us, the visitors who needs to change, the institution needs to change. And I think that's kind of where there is this tension, is thinking about, okay, we have this type of institution, but we're, at least programmatically, we're welcoming all these learners. How can we maybe shift the institution? There are, I won't take up more time, but just quickly, there are so many museums across the globe that are changing the way they create their spaces. There are museums that do have play spaces for kids, where they do have touch objects, but at least in terms of my dissertation, I'm looking at specifically these traditional object-based museums that have not changed, and think about how the programs can kind of teach the museum in a way. So.
I appreciated how, forgetting about this. I just imagine that I'm talking really loudly, sorry. I think it's really interesting how your study in this idea that what can the museum learn from the children, like what would add to this idea of multivocality in museums and inclusive museums. So
it's my job to turn it over to a larger conversation. You guys can stay here, or you can move around, because we only have about 15 minutes left, so you can sit if you'd like. Sure. I guess I want to bring it back to where we started almost 24 hours ago, downtown at our urban art space with our two exhibits, Transference and Assemblage, and I kind of started by encouraging you all to think about how our assemblage might disrupt your thinking, and what sorts of ideas and thoughts and knowledge is being transferred for us all through all of these conversations, starting with the work speakers of alumni from our program, and then the graduate student speakers from our three institutions, Teachers College, Penn State, and Ohio State. So I just kind of want to bring it back to that and put it all on you and ask if anybody has some sort of takeaways or thoughts that have been ignited, or questions even that you find yourself asking now as a result, or even inspirations. I'm always inspired to see what the next generation of scholars in our field are up to, and I feel like that's something that this particular gathering does for us, is remind us that there's a next phase of work that's happening, and that's important work, and thinking back to what's happened over the decades and where we're going next is something that I like to reflect on. Does anybody else have any sort of thoughts or takeaways?
Could I just say thanks to all the grad students who presented today, because I feel like my brain is just on fire in the best kind of way, and it has been just like deeply meaningful for me to be here and to engage with all of you today. So thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to say thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everyone who came and shared your work. I am so inspired. I look forward to working with all of you in the future. This is just, it gives me such hope. Thank you for all the hard and good work you're doing, all of you, and everyone here at OSU. Thank you. This was a really remarkable event.
I'd like to add to Graham Sullivan and I, sitting around, thought what the doctoral students are doing at our institutions. At that time, he was at Teachers College and I at Penn State in 2005. And we came up with this idea of graduate research art education conference, where those that have got to the point of a proposal that they could present their research and talk to each other. And I just want to thank Ohio State, all the coordinators, all the behind the scenes, because doing this back and forth, first Teachers College and Penn State, and then I think it was about 2010 perhaps or something, when, it was 2010 when Ohio State became involved in that, and this has lived on, and so I've seen this from 2005 to now, and it's just like this wonderful exchange, and I know the histories of those that have met each other, sometimes in the accommodations and discussing your work. These friendships have continued for, now over a decade. And so I thank you for continuing, and the presenters and the respondents. That's a huge endeavor that you two did.
I had no idea how much work it actually was.
the tone for me in thinking about story and how each one of these research focus that you bring to it is sort of stories that you're telling and then I think it's Michelle, right? Yeah, and then you sort of the transgression of story into these multiple chaos, you use that word, and I think about story in so many different ways, Chelsea, and actually how sound, we talked about later, is so much of her stories or narratives with the collages, all the different ways that you have contributed to us understanding our education further. I think, let's see, I think it's, let me see, Megan, yeah, Megan, no, actually, I'm sorry, it's Nicole, yes. The idea of thinking about, the idea of preparing people to be teachers. I think we often see dissertations about that first year of teaching out in the field in K through 12, but not as much about that higher ed kind of, as you mentioned, there's the pre-service stuff, but not so much about what we do as a field, as art educators, and preparing all of us, no matter what else we teach in our research, we end up also teaching that, how to prepare people to be teachers. And I know from sitting on like College of, a College of Arts and Architecture, sitting on those places where grants are given. Now, Matthew, your kind of research will garner funding. That makes sense to people as research. It does. And Nicole, what you're doing is the kind of stuff you have to explain in these kind of spaces because people don't understand there is an art, there is a lot of work that goes into how we teach people to be teachers. And that is not understood as research in the wider outside of our field, you know, and so just to kind of like, you know, what we're doing so many different kinds of things, but the idea of the very core of what we're doing does not make sense to anyone else as far as funding, as far as those grants. You have to really work at that narrative to make it make sense beyond our field that this is important as we teach people to be teachers and to teach art in all the broad and wonderful ways that each of you have contributed. So anyways, thank you all for continuing the GRAE.
Anybody else have any comments they want to add? Things you're walking away with?
Mary, are you at all interested in sharing what we talked about at lunch?
Sure.
Only if you want
Sure.
We're all looking at you.
All right, so I'm a historian at Ohio State. And so I'm one of Dr. Fletcher's students, and I've been thinking about a lot in the discipline of history. There's not as much conversation about how our identities as scholars affect the ways that we intend to teach and engage with the content and engage in the classroom and in the larger community. So I've thought throughout today about how important that is to you all and how my colleagues should probably give that more consideration. Because we think a lot about content, but not very much about who we are in delivering that.
Well, I'll end with a thank you all who've traveled for giving your Saturday to this activity, to our respondents and speakers. Thanks for coming to Ohio State. It's been an honor to have you here. I hope you have some time to explore a little bit this evening. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, OSU.